How did you come into the field of digital humanities?
So it actually started when I was a graduate student at Georgetown. I did my master's there, and I was a fellow at the Center for New Designs in Learning and Scholarship. And we were working on a number of projects that was the intersection of the humanities, of technology, and teaching. So we worked on a project called My Dante, which was an interactive environment for students reading Dante's Inferno. We were experimenting with teaching literature with wikis, digital storytelling. This is in the mid-2000s. And so I did that, and then I went on to do my Ph.D. at Emory. And when I was doing my Ph.D. research, which was on Black radicalism, I started to get frustrated with the ways that I couldn't really capture exactly what I wanted to say on paper, because I was trying to speak to multi-dimensional flows of Black radical thought throughout the world. And it was one of those moments where I thought, would this work better as a map? Would this work better as a visual representation? And so I was feeling very limited by what I could actually do in a Microsoft Word document. And so I ended up applying to be a HASTAC scholar with the idea of working on a project that tried to map Blackness in literature. And I integrated that into a class I was teaching on global Blackness. And so I worked with my students, and we created this map of how Blackness was articulated in South Africa, in England, and in the United States. And so that's really when I started thinking, actually, I really enjoy this kind of work, and more importantly, it's helping me answer particular kinds of questions that I really couldn't answer through the more traditional methods in which I was trained.
Well, that's interesting, because that's what is happening to my research. How when you interact with platforms, you bring new questions to the ground. Okay, so since you started in the field of DH, what have been some of the most rewarding opportunities while working in the field?
So in general, it's actually been around collaboration. I think one of the really exciting parts of doing digital humanities work is you can't do it alone. And you absolutely need to be working with other people and with their expertise and sharing expertise, bouncing ideas back and forth towards each other. So a few of the ones that were particularly fun, one was around DH, which was a project that Alex Hill at Columbia started. And so in the summer of 2014, for 80 days, we published entries on digital humanities projects around the world. And it was this fun opportunity to see what other work was out there and get to know some new people working in the field, and also really challenging the ways that people had been defining digital humanities. Another one that's been great is I've been a member of FemBot, the FemBot Collective. I've had the opportunity to work with Radhika Gujala and Carol Stabile as editing a special issue of Ada, the Journal of Gender, New Media, and Technology for them, and also getting to know them and hatching other ideas and getting to work with them has been really exciting. And then also collaborations at my own university. So I got there in 2013. I really wanted to think about how we could create undergraduate research opportunities for our students using our archives and using digital humanities. And I was very fortunate to get to know our archivist, Susan Edwards. And so we worked together to design an undergrad research program and to get a little funding for it, and to then work from there to build a digital humanities project on Salem, Massachusetts, where we're located, that would let our students explore some of the untold stories of Salem. So there, the main narratives are the witch trials and Nathaniel Hawthorne, but our archives don't have material on that. Our archives are really about ordinary people's lives, about immigration in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And so we've had a lot of fun getting the students into those archives and learning some new skills as they've developed digital humanities projects, really small projects based on that.
Wow, that's great. And from the other side, what have been some of the challenges while working in this field, especially considering your identity as a woman of color and your research interests as a post-colonial digital humanist?
So this has changed a lot over the last 5 years. So at first, it wasn't always the greatest experience to be a person whose main intervention often seemed to be, there may be some omissions in your way of thinking, or your project might be perpetuating particular kinds of biases that aren't made clear, and nobody likes to be told they're not doing things perfectly. And so there was definitely a little bit of pushback against that, I would say maybe about 6-7 years ago. And it wasn't only towards me, it was towards other people who were sort of in my community of people doing this kind of work. And then at some point, this is probably about 5 years ago, it transitioned into, please come be diverse for me. Please come give a talk. Please come be on a panel. And please talk about diversity. And, on the one hand, it provided me with a lot of opportunities to expand my network and meet people and to develop ideas. And really my book came out of doing all those talks. But at the same time, it sort of got to a point where I felt like I was being pigeonholed into being a person who's going to come and talk to you about diversity in digital humanities. And, at a certain point, I kind of ran out of things to say. And so I'd say maybe in the last year or two, a friend and I made a pact that we were going to stop doing diversity talks and do talks on, where we wanted our research agendas to go. And so now, if people invite me to come somewhere and ask me to do a talk like that, I just say, actually, here's what I'm working on now, and would you be interested? And overwhelmingly, yeah, they're absolutely interested in what's next, and not necessarily continuing to do those kind of diversity talks.
Exactly, because you're showing what else you have with you, right?
Yeah.
So, as a pioneer in the field, why is it important and necessary to intersect post-colonial, feminist, African American, and U.S. ethnic studies, among others, with the role of digital humanities?
So for me, this is really a question of equity and of justice. So at this moment, people who are engaged in digital humanities are creating, sustaining, and maintaining the digital cultural record. And in many ways, unfortunately, and this comes out of my training in post-colonial studies and African diaspora studies, I see the way this is reproducing a lot of the canons that already shape history, literary studies, cultural studies. And so, to me, the ethical imperative is to ensure that there is better representation in that record of perspectives, of histories, of stories coming out of ethnic studies, African American studies, African diaspora studies, post-colonial studies. But it's also not enough let me put it this way, representation is not enough. And that's why I frame it not about being about diversity, but about being about equity and justice. Because when these new perspectives, when these new projects are being created, they're transforming how we do digital humanities scholarship. Just right here at Recovery, everything that the people are working on is saying, if we're going to do digital humanities on this material and for these ethical reasons, it's going to change how we do it. We're going to need to make decisions about projects and metadata and digitization based on the material that's here and based on the cultural context, the many complicated transnational context here. So, I mean, that's really for me the vital question is, yes, we need representation, but then we also need to be changing how people do the work that they do.
Okay. So while working in digital humanities projects, what do you consider are the essential values to contemplate? For example, as what you mentioned, to work in collaboration, to use certain platforms or certain tools that can help. And in connection with that, it's what are the procedures you implement when planning and creating a digital project?
So I would say that I am mainly guided by minimalism. Money, time, and labor are really the three big issues that I'm always thinking about, particularly because I work at an institution where we don't have a digital humanities center. We don't have a lot of institutional support for the work that we're doing, and so we're just used to doing everything on a shoestring. So as a result, I always start with research questions. I always start with, what do I want to know? And do I need to use a digital humanities method to know what I want to know? Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is yes. If the answer is yes, then the next step is to think about what is the most minimal way I can try and ask and find some answers or find some new questions about the starting point. And so I always think small. I always use a proof of concept and sort of test out and see, is this approach even going to work? Is it even going to help me get a little bit further towards what I want to be doing or what I want to know? And I've talked about this as a form of micro digital humanities, that we can work on small scale sometimes, and sometimes a small scale is what we need to answer the questions we want to answer. And that's been really helpful for me as, under the circumstances in which I do this work. The small scale doesn't often end up being flashy or impressive, but for me, really, am I getting a new perspective on the research question I started with? It may not be answered. It's probably just going to lead to some new questions, but have I moved my thinking forward through it? And that's good. Yeah. And I would just add also, in some ways, I'm more interested in the process than the product. Products are good. I'd like to have some products, but I'm really interested in sort of how we do things and why we do things. And this has been something I've been thinking about a lot lately because I'm starting a new project working with Carol Stabile, thinking about how can we publish ebooks of unpublished intersectional feminist writing that's in archives. And it's been this chance to think really intentionally about process and what it means to implement a process, designed around intersectional feminist thinking in a project. So, one of the questions for us has been the question of labor. So how do we envision a labor model for doing the actual work that's needed to publish an ebook? And how especially can we do that without deciding that our labor is valued at zero? And to me, that's, I think, a really interesting question, because so often we think of the fact that we are undertaking this labor as meaning it doesn't cost anything. But of course it costs things. It means that that's something, we're not doing. Maybe in our personal lives or in our professional lives, that's a trade-off, and that labor is not zero. And so, thinking about how do we value that labor has been part of this project. Thinking about how do you design a platform that is specifically useful from the perspective of the user and the perspective of the material for intersectional feminist writing. How do we also think about long-term sustainability of a project like this, particularly around the question of, a financial model. We're really more interested in open access and getting these materials out of the archives and into classrooms. But, how do we find a balance between making sure that we're not doing this on a zero labor model, but also not charging or charging very much for it. So that's really been, I say, the first large-scale project that I've actually committed to. And it's really because I believe that, a lot more work needs to be done on those kinds of processes.
Exactly. I look forward to look at those kind of projects where you're integrating different intersectionalities. So in regards to publications, what are your approaches to making your work visible and valuable in relation to digital scholarship and the academia parameters?
So the first is I try to publish in open access journals or open access publications as much as possible, just because I want the work to be read. I want it to be able to be easily distributed. And so, that's a significant priority for me. And of course, not everything I publish is open access. I'd like to sort of move in that direction. But it's no surprise that my two best cited articles, one is both are from open access journals. They're peer reviewed journals, but they just happen to also be open access. And I don't think that's coincidence. And so that's been one dimension of it. And the other is we have an institutional repository for scholarship at my institution, and so trying to make sure I get everything in there so it's discoverable, and so at least I can send people articles through that if they request full text of an article. That's another dimension. And then the other is Twitter. I am completely okay with being a shameless self-promoter on Twitter and with pushing my work out there, and of course with supporting and sharing other people's work too. When I was a graduate student, I was asked to speak to a group of incoming graduate students who were first-year students. I think I was probably fourth or fifth-year graduate student, and I was asked to give them advice. And so my advice was get on Twitter. And the director of graduate studies immediately shut me down and said, no, don't waste your time on that. And even at the time I knew, I think he's wrong about that. But he really has been wrong about that, because I would say that I owe the vast majority of my career to Twitter. It's been a way to build a network. It's been a way to build a support system. Some of my closest academic friends are actually people I met on Twitter, and we read each other's work and support each other's work. And I've gotten invitations for talks, invitations for publications, all because I tweet. And so I can't overestimate the influence it's had on my professional career.
Have you had any challenges of publishing certain things of digital humanities, like the issue that sometimes academia still doesn't recognize digital humanities as something important?
Yes. I've had this experience both as someone writing and both as someone editing, because really the challenge is that, particularly when you're doing digital humanities work that intersects with African diaspora studies, ethnic studies, areas where the people who have the subject or content expertise may not be versed in the digital humanities side, and where the digital humanities reviewers are not versed in the content side. It's really hard to talk to those two audiences. My book is trying to do that, and the whole time I was convinced. The reviewers were going to say, "What the hell are you doing?" Because it's really hard to try and talk to and reach two audiences at the same time. Audiences that don't really talk to each other, and so it's really an interesting challenge. And so right now it's more as someone who's editing special issues or editing a collection, and there just aren't enough people who are doing scholarship that's right at those intersections. Mm-hmm. And then you also don't want to be continually putting pressure on them, because also sometimes they're your friends, to review everything, right? Because that takes time, and that's uncompensated labor, right? So that's the biggest issue, is how do you select reviewers who are going to push the scholarship in really important ways forward in both of these domains, but then also they aren't going to be completely turned off by the fact that they, from their disciplinary perspective or their field or methodological perspective, they're not recognizing what you're doing as being a way of doing their discipline's work.
I have seen a lot of that struggle, because of sometimes, like, some of the comments are, well, you're describing the project. Mm-hmm. But in that description, that's when those questions arose that can become theoretical mm-hmm. questions. But in some point, you have to describe the project mm-hmm. from the humanist side and from the mm-hmm. digital side in order to mm-hmm. find those intersections. And sometimes it's perceived as, well, you're promoting the project, but it's necessary to give mm-hmm. sometimes those descriptions in order to go further.
I completely sympathize, and I mean, there's a reason that I publish more in digital humanities journals than I have in disciplinary, in my content area backgrounds. I mean, I've had a lot of difficulty in trying to publish in some of those journals, and that's been a struggle. I mean, I had a circumstance where, actually, this was really nice, where 5 years ago I had the editor of a journal saying to me, oh, this isn't real scholarship, and then now coming and saying I was wrong. And this has now happened to me twice. And it's nice to think, okay, well, I'm glad you came around on that. But then the other time, 5 years ago, when I was, trying to establish my research agenda, I wish you had been a little nicer then.
Yes. So we have to prove it for them to recognize mm-hmm. your work. Wow. And I have seen also how you have visualized a lot of your work through your website. Mm-hmm. Like, that's where a lot of this can be accessible. Mm-hmm. And I really like how you distribute your website, because you're giving access to all this material.
I try. It's hard to keep. It's just one more thing to keep up with, right?
And it's more work.
It's totally more work.
So going into the next question, can you tell us more about your recent monograph title, New Digital Worlds, Post-colonial Digital Humanities in Theory, Praxis, and Pedagogy, that was published in 2018 by Northwestern University Press? And going next, what are you working on a forthcoming project? Can you tell us about it?
Absolutely. So, well, I mean, in some ways, this book, New Digital Worlds, which comes out in November, was a way of trying to work out how do you talk to multiple audiences at the same time. Going back to this problem we were just talking about, which is about what do you do with reviewers when you're getting reviewers from two different subjects with two different kinds of expertise who don't have the expertise in the other thing you're actually writing about. And so the audience for this book is really wide-ranging, from post-colonialists who I hope will get interested in what post-colonial studies has to offer, how we understand the digital cultural record, and also vice versa. How does digital humanities work help us understand what post-colonial studies is and does? digital humanities practitioners who might need to think about the ways that they can interrogate the work that they do and think about the ways that they may or may not be participating in reproducing colonialist knowledge production through digital humanities projects. Graduate students who, I hope will want to do this kind of work. It's a range of audiences. And so in the book, I look at connections between post-colonial studies and digital humanities over different points in time. I talk about the particular kinds of epistemic violence that gets perpetuated through digital humanities projects and its relationship to the influence of colonialism on knowledge production and that longer history. I talk about how we can actually introduce both small and larger scale digital humanities projects into undergraduate classrooms to get them thinking about what post-colonial approach to digital humanities looks like, and also interrogate what are we really talking about when we talk about the global and global digital humanities. So it's trying to do a lot of things, but more importantly, it's not meant to be prescriptive. It's not saying here is how you should do this work, but it's saying how can we move this conversation forward to really think critically about the work that we are doing.
So it's already available?
No, it's November 15th.
Okay. And are you currently working on something else, or? Yes.
So one of the things I'm currently working on is co-editing an edition of for the Debates in the Digital Humanities series called the Digital Black Atlantic with Kelly Baker Josephs. And what we're trying to do in that is bring together a lot of different approaches to digital humanities within the African diaspora. So, there's a lot of really important and exciting pockets where digital humanities work is being done. So, there's Caribbean digital humanities, there's African American digital humanities, there's Black digital humanities, there are digital humanities initiatives being developed in countries in Africa, like in Nigeria, South Africa, in countries in the Caribbean, in Dominica, Jamaica, and other countries. And so, we're trying to bring these different voices and practices together to sort of shed light on what they are. We're not necessarily putting them in conversation with each other because we have a number of different essays written by people doing this kind of work, but the idea is an assemblage of the range of practices of African diaspora digital humanities, and specifically also when we do this kind of work, these kinds of use digital humanities methods, use digital tools, and do so in the context of material on African descended people, how does what we need to do change? Mm-hmm. You can see a theme.
Yeah. Wow, it's so interesting because as we have been working with the U.S.-Mexico Borderland project, we have seen that there's several other projects that are using digital platforms, mm-hmm. and how each project is different, but at the same time they're intersecting mm-hmm. each other, bringing up different voices mm-hmm. of this region.
Yeah, and I think that, for a really long time, it seemed like digital humanities conversations were all about defining what it was and what its limits were. It's nice to not have to start every digital humanities article or talk or conversation with defining digital humanities. There was a time when that was every first part of my talk. Here's how I'm using it, and I think that we've moved into different conversations mostly. So, that's been nice to not have to do that gesture. It's kind of like when post-colonialists spend the first 3 pages of their article defining what post-colonialism is and exactly how they're using it. So I was used to doing that because that's what I was trained in. But at the same time, it sort of always felt like, okay, I'd like to get to the point here, and not sort of do all this throat clearing. But on the other hand, those definitions are still really recalcitrant when it comes to peer review. And so, in some ways there is still that challenge to make what you're doing legible to whatever scholarly community you're talking to or the audience of a journal. Still thinking, you have to keep thinking about how do you fashion what you're doing sort of in language that they're going to understand. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to change what you're doing. It might mean changing the presentation of what you're doing to try and make it, legible is probably a good word, make it legible to the people who are going to be reading it as something that they understand.
Especially like in conferences also, like if it's a humanities conference, it's more approach to that side, and like you can, that's what we have seen, like our project has been able to be presented in different fields, but at the same time you have to modify how you will be presenting in order for the audience to look at the importance.
What's the nice thing about being trained in the humanities is we think about audience, we think about genre, we think about purpose in everything we write and everything we do. And this is a slight tweak on that because we're also talking about being able to talk to multiple communities, which involves mastery of multiple kinds of knowledge. But at the same time, we have the skills to do it. So that's the nice part. And then the other... I did start working on a new book, which it's for about 5 months now, and so it's at that fun point where it's about everything. But if I had to boil it down, it's really looking at the question of what does it mean to be a scholar of color in the humanities in the 21st century. Thinking about a number of perspectives, like how do we do research? And how do the knowledge infrastructures available to us, like scholarly databases, support what we're researching, but then also influence the outcomes of our scholarship in particular ways. So I have a chapter I've been working on W.B. Du Bois's work and looking at citational practices and for his novels that nobody reads. And so how are those databases kind of unintentionally promoting and then obscuring particular narratives about Du Bois's work. I'm looking also at what does it mean to be a public intellectual at this particular moment in time? What's the value? What's the danger? How do we think about how we're disseminating our research, particularly in the realm of scholarly communication? And really sort of, again, as I was saying, what does it mean to be a scholar of color in the humanities? And how do we locate that in a broader intellectual tradition that includes people like Du Bois, whom I mentioned, Claudia Jones, Sylvia Winter, and again, particularly at this moment of turmoil in higher education. So exactly. I'm really excited about this project, and it in some ways it's building on some of the work I did in New Digital Worlds, but at the same time it's kind of in a completely different direction because it's really focused on the individual scholar and less on what's happening in a field.
But I think it's necessary because sometimes those key points are invisibilized. And they have to be highlighted in order because as time is passing, more people of color is getting involved in this field, especially because that's how they can visualize or create spaces of their research.
Last week or the week before, I tweeted something about how every book that I was ever assigned to read in graduate school that was about how to be a scholar was written by a white man at an elite institution. And almost all the advice in there was completely wrong for me. And, when I look at the really exciting work that people are doing, and then, it makes me think, is there a way that we can link it to a broader intellectual tradition, and specifically in the context of an African diasporic tradition as well, because sometimes it's nice to sort of see what are the lessons we can learn from the people who are doing this work before us.
Yes. And according to what you mentioned during the colonial and post-colonial digital humanities roundtable on October 27 of 2017, and I quote, "The digital cultural record has largely ported over the hallmarks of colonialism from the cultural record unthinkingly without malice, in part because post-colonial critique has not made many inroads in the practices of digital humanities scholarships. And with this in mind, where do you envision digital humanities to be in 5 years, and where do you think it will be?"
Well, so it depends. I mean, really the answer to the question depends on the day. Is it a good day or is it a bad day? I'm not sure what today is. But, I think what digital humanities is going to be is it's really in the hands of the graduate students. And, it's in the hands of scholars like you who are doing such exciting and creative work. And, part of the reason that a lot of what I've done is focused on what we might call the meta dimensions of digital humanities is because, I want us to be continually evaluating and reevaluating how we do the work we do, how we choose the tools we choose, how we make very clear what is included and what isn't included and why in the digital scholarship that we produce. And to me, that would be a major step forward. And I think it's practically achievable in the next 5 years. We're already seeing that starting to happen, and that's been very exciting. In that roundtable that you referenced, I talked a little bit about the work that Megan Ward and Adrienne Woznicki have done on Livingston Online, and how they've done this really interesting job of recognizing that they're working on a figure, David Livingston, who has this history that is deeply linked to colonialism, but at the same time they don't let that go unremarked, and there's a lot of really interesting framing in their project around that. And so, those are the steps forward that people really need to be making. And if we could be doing that with our scholarship, we'd be way better off.
Exactly. So, as I really admire your work, and because it has expanded my knowledge in the field of digital humanities and has given me the tools to intersect praxis with theory within my research interest. So what is your advice for scholar activists who are using the advantages of technology to create spaces that visualize communities or topics that have been on the margins because they're not part of the canon? I think it's really related to what you mentioned.
Absolutely. I'm going to go back to collaboration. One of the biggest time wasters is if we reinvent the wheel, metaphorically speaking. If we try and create something new for the sake of creating something new when a platform, for example, that already exists might suffice. That goes back to my point also about minimalism. We're talking particularly with scholar activists, and particularly in whether it's in Latinx studies, in African diaspora studies, feminist studies. We're talking about people who have a lot of burdens on their time, right? They have the burden to do at least double, if not more, work to prove their worth and value. They're asked to do a lot of more service work, particularly around advising students, serving on diversity committees, being the person sitting at the table, so they have a brown person in the room, often under hostile circumstances where you're fine to be the brown person in the room, just make sure you don't say anything too challenging. If they're scholars and activists, those are two time-consuming tasks, definitely two full-time jobs. So, trying to, feeling the pressure to also create something brand new from the ground up, can be a lot. And maybe in some respects, and for some people asking too much, because ultimately everybody's got to sleep at some point. And so, finding the people you can work with, thinking about how you can build on existing projects and reach out to and collaborate with people who are already doing projects that may be sort of in the ballpark of what you're doing, and that, maybe there's a collaboration there. Also, I would say, well, that aside, I would also say that, sometimes the tools we have aren't sufficient. Sometimes the methods we have for the materials that we're working with aren't good enough. And so there are times where, we will have to create something new. Mm-hmm. And in that regard, again, collaboration and finding people to work with and who support the work, and who bring particular kinds of expertise that you may not yourself have, is really, really important. It's not sustainable for one person to do all of that.
Yeah, but it's necessary too.
It's necessary and it would be nice also if it wasn't the responsibility of just people of color. And that goes back to your last question, which is where should digital humanities be in 5 years? If everybody starts doing their job on this end, A, will make it a lot better for us, and B, it won't always be our problem.
Yeah. But do you find, I know that collaboration, it's great, but sometimes academia, especially in the humanities, it's problematic because the system is not designed for academics to work in collaboration. Mm-hmm. How do you have been dealing with those kind of structures that give you the opportunity to create projects, but when it comes to when they hire a position, it's only for one person, and that's how, or the recognition, how do you recognize all the labor?
That is an absolutely good and important question. I think that we have to take it apart though, right? So there's several pieces of it. One is, if you are, say, a professor and you're a tenure track professor and you're doing digital humanities scholarship, it's in collaboration. The structures of tenure, promotion, or even structures of hiring to get into that job are maybe looking a little askance at the fact that you have digital projects, or these projects were done in collaboration with people, and also, do you also have enough scholarship of the articles and books kind? That's what they're looking at, and so that's one set of problems. What I've found is that you have to look for the guidelines that different professional organizations have put together on how to evaluate digital scholarship. Look to the advice of people who've managed to get tenure and get hired doing this kind of work. And then also recognize to some extent you'll be doing twice as much work. You'll be doing double work because, in many cases, most people aren't going to say, yeah, your digital humanities project and you got a $40,000 grant and that's great, that's good enough. They're also going to say, where's your book? Or where are your 10 articles? How are you measuring the impact of your digital humanities project, right? So in that kind of role, that's one kind of problem. And this is not at all to speak for librarians, but what I've observed from collaborating very closely with a librarian is that there are a different set of pressures based on the fact that she is a librarian. There's the fact that, she can't really get release time. She can't get a course release to do this work because she's not teaching courses in the way that, you could release a professor from teaching a course. Mm-hmm. So that's either something means something else she has to give up out of her job to undertake digital humanities work, or what really happens, it's something she does on top of her job. So it's just more work, right? And so, that's been really eye-opening for me working in collaboration with her because, it's really, I've sort of seen firsthand, okay, how our jobs are very different, and there are ways that my job as a tenure track professor does give me certain latitude that, hers as a librarian doesn't because of the way our jobs are structured at the same institution and governed by the same union contract. It's really been really interesting. And then, people, and I'm not having closely collaborated with people in other kinds of jobs. I can't really speak to that, but certainly people in alt-act positions and other kinds of staff positions as well, they'll have their own pressures too. For us, one of the ideas we've been talking about at our institution at Salem State with our collaborations is creating project charters. So I learned about this from Lori Taylor at University of Florida, where she does a lot of work on digital humanities, and she's one of the people behind Digital Library of the Caribbean. And the project charter sort of lays out from the beginning who's involved, what are the responsibilities of everybody involved, who can speak about the project under what circumstances, and how's the credit distributed, and I think in large part in the collaborative model we have at Salem State, which also now includes Justin Snow, who's our digital initiatives librarian. We work really well together, and so we haven't really had issues around labor, but where we've had issues is when we started collaborating with other faculty members of the university who don't share the same values that we do and the same understanding of the particularities and the limitations of each of our jobs and how our paid gigs, the jobs we're actually being paid to do, relates or doesn't relate to the digital humanities projects we're working on. And so that's where the charters have been more useful, is setting out expectations in advance. And then the other thing to think about is given the different kinds of job roles that can all be part of a collaboration, what one person needs for their career advancement is not necessarily the same thing that someone else needs. So, and this is just so hypothetical, right? I might need to be able to say I gave a talk and wrote a paper. And so I might give a talk, or we might give a talk, and we might write a paper, I might write a paper, and usually we end up allocating authorship in order of who contributed the most to the paper, right? For example. But and I tend to actually do most of the work on that, and I tend to end up being the first author, but partially we're doing that because I need that for tenure. They need other things, like they're asked to demonstrate, that they've done their job through different things. It may be through, how much of our collection got digitized and the metadata got created for it. Mm-hmm. So some more of that work might be done, by the two librarians because they're claiming the credit for that in their evaluation procedures. But really, it really comes down to having the expectations laid out and clear on time so everybody feels like, their voices are heard, their labor is valued, that nobody's taking advantage of them.
That's great. And to conclude, what are some of the projects that work with women of color and feminism? Do you think there is still a lack of representation in projects of this kind? And what is the role women of color have in DH?
That, another excellent question. It's never enough, right? It is never enough. I think there's two ways to approach this. One is that there are a number of great projects. One of my favorites is Chicana por mi raza. I think you had Maria Cotera.
Yes.
That's one of my absolute favorite projects. Because of the really important work it's doing on shedding light on the history and the stories and the voices of Chicana activism. And but for every project like that, there's still so much more that needs to be done. Mm-hmm. But again, this goes back to me saying again a lot, but this goes back to me saying that this shouldn't only be our problem. One of the things that I've seen happening that's been really interesting is projects on women that have existed for a very long time, for decades, are actually starting to ask, how do we make sure that we're doing a better job of representing the category of women in the time that we're writing? Because a lot of these projects, when they were created, they could have been called the White Women's Writers Project, or white women writers, right? But when I look at projects like the Orlando Project, it's a Canadian project. They're doing really interesting work with their metadata and their tagging schema to kind of make the intersectional dimensions of some of the people in their project legible, and to think about how they're also making sure that they're consciously finding the women of color writing in the time period they covered, and making sure that they're there, and then and thinking about how they're there and how they're represented as well. And Women Writers Project too, we see the work they're doing, and they're also taking a critical look at what they're doing, and and thinking about representation. And so in addition to the new work, we need more of that reflexive, critical eye being cast back on existing work to find out, where did we accidentally construct the category of women as white women while calling it women, and how do we make sure we undo some of the damage done by that?
I don't know if you have anything else to add on, but what is the role of women of color? What is the role women of color have in DH?
In what regard?
I don't know, like if it's important to have more women of color in DH, if it's necessary because they will bring up other kind of knowledge, other concepts. What do you think? Why is women of color necessary in this field?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly what you're saying, right? It's about the perspectives that come out of the experiences of these scholars. It's often that these scholars, women of color, are often the ones studying women of color and thus have, the expertise. They are the ones with the expertise to create, digital humanities projects that represent and share the stories of women of color in equitable ways. Yeah, I mean that would be the main reason they're important, and that we're important. And then the other would be that the perspective we bring on how we do scholarship, right? The ways we were trained from our mentors and from our disciplines and our fields, that needs to be brought to bear on the practices of creating digital humanities if we really do want to say that, we're working towards justice and equity in the digital cultural record.
Perfect. So would you like to add anything else to conclude?